Yeah, thanks very much. So, good morning from very hot Riverside, California. My name is Brandon Brown, and my background is I was trained as an epidemiologist and became interested in research payments in mouse studies on HIV and HPV vaccine, including exploring these issues as a RETI scholar. I saw how the impact of how incentives, how that impact on participants is, and for instance, it helped recruitment in one study compared to another because incentives for participants and their families, it kind of helped really rapid recruitment for one study compared to another study. And I wanted to look at that a bit more. I'm also on the ethics review board at my institution, so I see lots of studies on payments that proposed. And in reviewing the agenda for this year, I know that you've discussed the Belmont report, some PI challenges, and also an ethical framework for recruitment. And I think participant payment plays a big role in all of those. So I'm happy to be here today, even via Zoom due to our COVID surge in Riverside. So I want to start by asking you to imagine that you're a potential study participant, a person living with HIV visiting the clinic to get your meds. You get a study flyer with this text, and you make a conscious decision if you're interested to learn more. Most people might see this and say, what's in it for me? And one thing is the prospect of contributing data towards developing an HIV cure, but it's also good to remember that this is research, not something that's expected to give great clinical benefit. So if we offered you payment in the amount here, what might influence your interest? Will that change your interest in this study? So if it was $5, if it was $100, what about $10,000? None of those are extraordinary by any means. But what about if the number of visits vary? That might also make a difference if it was one visit, 5 visits, visits across 2 years. Now, if we're in the role of a participant, we could ask ourselves if knowing what's been provided in the past studies that we participated in might help us make a decision. But if we are new to research, it might be hard to get a sense of what is fair. And if we change our role from a study participant to an IRB analyst or to the PI of the study or a study sponsor, where might we be able to obtain that data? It's a good question. And what about knowing the risk about the study? Should studies with higher risk pay people more? Some might argue that delves into the payment for risk in consideration in the risk-benefit calculation in IRB reviews and kind of overcoming risk with money. But it can be seen different by different populations. So just to give you a quick intro, the U.S. regulations, including the Office of Human Research Protection, they tell us that payment is acceptable, but we have to be careful not to influence participants with payment. And we don't see much here about exploiting participants with payments being too low or at zero, which may be a more important worry, at least these days. But still, people seem to be worried about undue influence and coercion, at least in high-risk studies, and these are likely to be more the exception than the norm. And the terms coercion and undue influence might often be used precisely or interchangeably. Coercion usually is not a problem with payment, since in most cases there is no real threat to giving payment by itself. But one example is a scenario that was given to me by a colleague from RETI a few years back, where he did a very short survey. He asked people who were homeless in California if they would donate an eye, one of their 2 eyes, for $10,000. And many people said yes, but that eye donation study probably wouldn't get IRB approval, at least there are some safeguards in place. But looking at undue influence, we can kind of ask ourselves what is excessive or what is inappropriate. Really, there is no guidance on this, and my perspective of what's inappropriate in terms of payment might be very different than yours. There are 3 main payment categories. These were reintroduced in 2018 in a New England Journal of Medicine article, at the end of the slide. But I'd like to focus on incentives today, since they seem more ethically problematic than reimbursing someone for their time or even compensating someone for expenses to get to be involved in a study, which seems more obvious. But one point I have here is that having an abstract categorization of payments that you can see on the slide does not necessarily help us make decisions on the payments themselves. We know that consumers can, rapidly compare prices for identical products across multiple providers to get a fair price. We do this on, Amazon. We do this on Google. But in research, we really have no other resource other than our own personal experience to determine, what is an appropriate incentive amount. And this is an ongoing problem in research, in my view. Now, hopefully, you've all seen that incentives are very common. I think we all use them in our research. Sometimes the payment amounts can be high, and one factor related to incentives is that they can skew the sample selection with research participants who are more likely to be economically disadvantaged. You can see a real example here. Do you want to sleep? Get $17,000 to sleep and live in a hospital for a week. Seems like a good use of time if you can get away and need a break. And again, we might get different populations volunteering for these different studies. For me, I can't go to sleep for a week in a hospital because my chickens need me on my farm, for example. So there may be at least some cases where high incentives for people are inappropriate, but what about incentives that are too low or studies without payments? Is that also inappropriate? For example, if we don't pay someone, is it disrespectful to people's time? So the question of what's an appropriate incentive and who decides what's appropriate is really unanswered. And incentive decisions are often made by what's been provided in the past, how much funding there is for a project, maybe beliefs about what's fair, what might be the standard, or by participant and research factors. What are like the local costs, salaries, healthcare access, things like that. And one limitation is we have very little data on incentives and really no way to compare incentives to help us decide what's appropriate. And one place we might think to look for this data is the IRB, but usually online IRB software does not have incentives kind of as a standalone item to put dollar amounts and compare across studies. And if institutions use paper IRB applications like mine, you could really forget about that option. Even on certain places that we would think really have a strong catalog of incentive information or payments, like clinicaltrials.gov, there's really no one specific place to report your participant payments. So really there's no user-friendly data or guidance. And on one end, the Belmont report states that undue influence and undue inducement research must be avoided. But no one's really figured out what undue inducement means in the 40 years since it was written. And experts kind of note the importance of incentives not being excessive, but it's more of a I'll know it when I see it kind of phenomenon that happens, rather than here's what's inappropriate, here's what's appropriate. And as researchers, I think we should care about incentives because they can help us enroll participants and do our research. One argument that I've heard often in studies with people who inject drugs is that by giving them money, they're going to go out and buy more drugs and overdose. So we've contributed to their illness or death. Now this is obviously, I'm presenting it in a way that is pretty paternalistic, but there are also other reasons why we should care about incentives. Incentives can make people enthusiastic to join high-paying studies, and this can harm science if we don't truly qualify for these studies. And there's also the issue of research monetizing good behaviors, where people might decline something like an HIV test when they're offered that by a provider if they're not giving a financial incentive to do so, like in a study they participated in. So the question could come up, how much are you going to give me for that HIV test? Because if they're offered an HIV test as part of their routine care, which also may be unlikely, there might be the expectation of being paid for it as they are in research. So let's see. And there are some recent studies that illustrate how payment can be ethically problematic. For instance, a UCSD study has been rejected many times over the years. This is the University of California, San Diego, down the street from Riverside. So where people are, it was proposed to give girls $1,000 to remain uncut to prevent female genital mutilation. The study keeps on getting rejected. Or the media coverage on the gene-edited baby study in China to remove the CCR5 protein and prevent HIV. In the consent of the study, parents must agree to pay $15,000 if the study early. So that's a pretty big incentive to stay in the study. And building upon the topic of paying if you exit, what about if you pay to enter into a clinical trial? Is that ethical? People are trying to answer that question right now. And speaking of payment and research, many of us may also be painfully aware of how often we have to pay a fee to publish in a journal, and it's becoming, more journals are kind of taking this up. So the payment topic is kind of all around us in research. And what about something that might hit us kind of closer to home for the global pandemic, and paying people to join a research study in which they will be exposed to COVID-19 tests if a vaccine is efficacious? This is happening as well, and you can read more about that in Science and Nature. This is a big one taken on that topic. So those are just a very few specific cases to try and illustrate the point of the importance of payments in research. Most of the time, you're actually not required to provide payment data, and this contributes to not having data because it's not being shared. And there are some pretty paramount publications by Dickert and Grady that point to unexplained variation in payments, even in the same study at different study sites. And also, one of the things that they found is that organizations might not know what proportion of their studies pay participants. So the literature really says that we don't know much about participant payments. But how are incentives, for example, decided upon? In a perfect world, and I think people, as part of this quarter, are probably more aware than people outside, people would expend some significant effort kind of reviewing studies, talking with PIs working in the same population, maybe asking participants what they want. But this is a very lengthy process, and most people are unwilling to go through this before their project is funded, because you need the money first to go through all that effort. And in the real world, decisions are made prior to the study when thinking about a budget, and incentives are often not the focus of planning any study unless you do a study like me on incentives. And investigators may rely on the IRB for input, and the IRB may kind of defer to the investigator as the expert. So there is often a circular reliance without any really delegated responsibility on participant payments. And this is a IRB checklist form from an Ivy League university where I stayed for a little while to study the topic of payment. And I was happy to see in there some attention to payment, even if a little bit. But as you could see in the text outline in red, they touch on the presence of coercion or undue influence. But really there's no answer as to how this is determined, who makes that decision. So who knows about that? But you will also notice on this form that you really see nothing about payment being too low, which means that might not be a big priority. Sorry, was there a question? There was a little cough.
Just a cough, sorry.
Okay. Okay. Just want to be aware in case anyone has questions. So how do we solve this problem of not knowing what to provide to people? We need real study data to get a sense of what payment amount is appropriate. Otherwise, we just have our opinions. And the first step in my mind is to know what's been done in the past and ask people what they think about it. So maybe we can create some scenarios to help us judge the appropriateness of amounts of payment and research. Now here you can see a study that we did about payment amounts at one institution, which was University of California, Riverside. And we compared to social behavioral and clinical studies and tried to examine what might influence payment in those types of studies. My own IRB was kind enough to give me access to their office and rummage through the paper data because we still use a paper system. And we found some factors that are related to payments and kind of highlighted our own variation in payment based on the type of study. So you can see here that payment and amounts differ by the type of research, qualitative versus quantitative, the study population, the number of visits, the number of time required by the study, and also risk. But who says what UCR does in terms of payment practices is correct? We only have this one example. And what if we had this from every institution, or at least a collection of institutions? Now that would actually be data and us knowing about payment and research projects on a more broad sense. And this data could be made public, and maybe we could have a growing database for all to see and understand where your proposed study might fall in the range of payments offered. One thing about doing that whole process, obviously, is it's a lot of work, especially if you use paper systems. But what about something kind of closer to home? In 2020, we conducted a retrospective review of participant payments in RETI research projects funded over the past 8 years. Now, as we know, our projects include mostly low-risk research projects in the US and abroad, and all, if not all, have a focus on HIV and drug abuse. Since we had some international studies, we converted all the currencies to US dollars just to have 1 point for comparison. And payment data from a total of 46 studies were reviewed, including more than half in the continental US and the rest spanning 4 continents. And among the studies, about 66% provided cash, with the average payment amount of $34. And the range was $0 to $115. And it's no surprise, studies in the US paid significantly more than those conducted abroad, with $51 mean in the US versus $15 outside the US. And intricacies of payments in different settings and even in the same settings are pretty vast. And this is the case even within our own group of studies, which are all HIV and drug use related. So I thought that was pretty interesting to have another case study just from RETI. So now on to a study that my team is about to finish up. I got some funding from Merck to get a sense of what people think about payments and research. Here are some basic demographics for a survey that we did with 300 people living with HIV, obtained from a nationally representative sample. And just a note, and probably many of you know this if you do a lot of internet-based research, to get these 300 participants, we had thousands of people try to enroll in our study who were ineligible, just because they wanted the incentive. So this is something that I think that we all have to deal with at these times where a lot of research is moving online. So the responses to our questions on payment seem to be promising. We could see, the majority said that payment plays a role. that people should receive payment to participate, and that there should be a standard policy for participant payment. Now, of course, there are some limitations to the data, but what's interesting is that the majority saw payment as a benefit of research. And we know that for IRBs, payment is not a factor in weighing the risks and benefits of the study, but money sure is seen as a benefit by participants. We just got this in AIDS and Behavior a few months ago, and you could read more about the results, including differences by gender, education, and altruism in terms of HIV research participation. And after we completed the nationwide survey, we did some qualitative research with 3 different stakeholder groups in the research process, including people living with HIV, who would be the study participants, the researchers or PIs who proposed payment amounts, and IRB members or analysts who approved protocols with proposed payment amounts. We wanted to get a sense of what these different groups think about payments and research. In the qualitative data, the majority of participants from all stakeholder groups said that incentives were a good thing. You can also see here that a low incentive amount was seen by some as insulting. So there may be a minimally acceptable amount for some people in research. And people living with HIV mentioned that low incentives may be unethical, but it's no surprise that IRB members and researchers were more worried about high incentives. We also could see here the potential impact of low incentives that the stakeholders mentioned, including not feeling valued and not really being able to participate, which is interesting. And then what about high incentives? When we're thinking about this, respondents talked about truthfulness, adherence, and expectation of risk, and accepting more risk. They weren't, we didn't give these things as options, they just came up, but they also validated our previous beliefs about high incentive amounts. Now, we know that IRBs often are specifically tasked with ensuring the ethical guidance that payment can't overcome the risk for the risk-benefit ratio, and that's followed. Yet there were participants from all 3 stakeholder groups, including people living with HIV, IRB analysts, and investigators, who said that more study risk as well as more invasive study procedures deserve higher payment to the participants. And when it comes to a method for determining incentive amounts, researchers wanted something easy. Give me something easy to use to make this decision. And all 3 stakeholder groups agreed about the importance of those with lived experience with the research topic under study having a voice in incentive decision making. And this probably also makes sense because they could tell us what people, what their population needs to participate in research, to be retained in research, rather than us as study investigators guessing about what might work. But, okay, so people in the survey and people in focus groups and interviews said that they think incentives are important, and that's good. And now we are looking to create a Vignette, which is just a hypothetical study scenario with some details, and then asking people about incentive levels and ranges. You can see kind of a made-up scenario on the screen with some attributes and different options that might be relevant when deciding on participant payments. Things like time living with HIV, study risk, personal income, and presence of comorbidities. And I put a little bit of text and then a table with the different attributes per factor that could go into the vignette. And at this moment, our community advisory board is in the process of helping us select the final study factors of vignettes. And obviously we're not studying from scratch because we have an existing list of factors that have come up in our nationwide survey study that I showed you, in our focus groups, and also in our discussion with our community advisory board members, who are people living with HIV. And you can see here just a quick screenshot of factors which may impact perceptions of how people think about incentives and how incentives should be decided upon in the study. So these could be things I think I mentioned before, like risk, time commitment, travel, economic level, if the study is first in humans, if there's COVID risk, if a treatment interruption is required, and if ancillary care is provided. So we kind of pulled the community advisory board to give us ideas of study factors, and we created a list of these study factors. And then the investigators and the CAS are right now going back and trying to find the top 6. So once we have that, once we have these top 6 to 8 factors, then we can create the skeleton of the vignette, of the text. One example of which I showed you about 2 slides ago. And then we can create the 25 vignettes per study participant. And each participant will actually give an acceptable monetary range of incentives that they think makes sense for that study, for that vignette. Some of the vignettes will be fixed so that everyone sees the same choices among the factors, so we can compare the 3 groups. Again, people with HIV, IRB members, and investigators. And other vignettes will be kind of randomly made up. That way we can cover as many of the choices as possible to get a sense of acceptable incentive amounts. And in the end, we'll actually get an average minimally acceptable incentive amount, a median incentive amount, and an average maximum acceptable incentive amount for the scenario, which is pretty cool. And I don't think it's something that people have done before. And again, we're just starting with HIV as a topic of interest because that's our expertise. But it could also unfold and be applicable to other kinds of studies. So why are we doing this? With data collection, we could refer to what incentives have already been provided in similar studies, and this is a start. This is a move towards full reporting. Justification on payment amounts could be made to ethics committee applications and to sponsors for budget considerations. And then we will understand better about what people need to participate and to adhere in research. And really this is unexplored territory. And maybe we are overpaying people unnecessarily, or maybe we are chronically underpaying people for their time. There may be a formula to use for decision making that is independent of any one study, and hopefully we can find that. But like with everything else, there are definitely risks to knowing the realities of research. And one might be that incentives or payment amounts proposed don't meet the criteria for being appropriate by the IRB, and that they cannot proceed to the study. So for studies like dissertations or a thesis project, that might pose a problem if people don't have enough money to give an appropriate payment if we have this data that says the amount that they want to provide is inappropriate. So while I list this as a risk, I think we just need to be mindful of limited budgets. So anyway, I know that was quick, about half an hour. And I think knowing more about incentives and payments in research would be good. I think that most people that I talk with make incentive or participant payment decisions independently of anything else because they have their own kind of internal database in their brains that we use to make those decisions based on what we think is fair. But I think it's time to go to more of a data-driven process, because this is one aspect of research that people are just proposing and making decisions that are not based on data, and data are generated for each study, and we just have to access that data. So that's all I have for my presentation. I think I have some references in here. But yeah, thank you, and let me know if you have questions. Hopefully you do.